Buongiorno. I'll speak in English if that's okay, because no one would understand me if I tried to speak in Italian, so thank you very much. I'll just begin briefly by saying an anecdote. So this is a quote that says, "If men were able to be convinced that art is precise advanced knowledge of how to cope with the psychic and social consequences of the next technology, would they all become artists?" And we're talking here about the future, the near future of museums, but I think we're also talking about, can museums predict the future? And who is going to make that future of museums? So I want to ask you, do you think art can predict the future? And I'll tell you about this piece we exhibited at Science Gallery. It's a piece by an artist called Heather Dewey-Hagborg. It's called Stranger Visions. And she went around the city and picked up cigarette butts. And just like you saw earlier, she extracted DNA from the cigarette butts or chewing gum. And she used software to find certain traits out of that DNA. Ethnicity, whether somebody might have light or dark hair, what their skin color might be, whether they're tall, short, have a propensity to obesity. And she 3D printed the faces of these people who littered their cigarette butts and then put them in the gallery. So these were the faces of the litterers, maybe. This process is a human process, so maybe personal motivations or personal discrepancies or discrimination was present in this, but it was very interesting and it provoked a conversation. Should this be legal? Should you be able to take someone's DNA off the street if they've littered it or lost it, like the movie Gattaca, and extract it, maybe map their whole genome and put their face on a wall? It was a provocative artwork in a show we had called Grow Your Own, which was about synthetic biology. And many of the visitors thought, this is science fiction. This is far in the future. And 1.5 years later, these are an installation in Hong Kong as part of an anti-littering campaign. Not 2 years later, a public authority was using the same technique to name and shame or put the faces of people who littered around the city in public. It made a lot of headlines, you might have seen it. But what's amazing is that only 2 years prior, this was a speculative design fiction project. This was artwork, and now it's reality. In 2 years, can we have a debate about whether this should be legal, whether we should be prepared for it, whether we like it, whether we value it, whether it's regulated? I think 2 years is a very small time, so I think art is needed to predict the future, and museums need to be doing that. And this is one surprising example. So a little about my own perspective. I will show you a very brief video, I won't show you all of it, about Science Gallery so you know where I'm coming from.
Came to work in the Science Gallery as a mediator, and it just sparked off the love of science again. It made me remember why I'd started, why I'd done it in the first place. Very often as a mediator you see people walk in and maybe they wouldn't be interested or they wouldn't understand, and they leave with this genuine feeling of inspiration. They really feel like what you've told them is important and it's something that they'll remember for the rest of their lives, I think.
Visually beautiful, and there was just so much to learn.
It's all creative, we're really creative, and it's quite interactive, so it's really good, we're enjoying it.
Oh, it's excellent, it really is, yeah. I've come to a lot of the exhibitions.
To be honest, the Science Gallery has kind of changed my life in a strange kind of way, because it really allowed me to engage with the general public. And we ran an experiment here, got loads of samples off the Irish population and examined their immune systems in great detail. That was a great thrill. I think nobody else in the world had been able to do that.
I really love being in the gallery. People are coming in and talking to them. They ask questions in ways that I haven't framed them myself, so it does help my research in a certain way. It helps my students because they get excited again when they see everybody else getting excited about their work. I enjoy the interaction and kind of sharing, I suppose, my enjoyment and my enthusiasm. It's ended up being a really great experience.
You never know what's going to happen next at the Science Gallery. It's the creativity of the team that's just amazing.
we fund a lot of scientific research, which can be regarded as ivory tower stuff. The thing about a location like this is it connects that science with the man on the street. And with kids in your target audience, 15 to 25, who are learning about this stuff in an exciting way, and it gets that passion back into it.
So I might, it goes on for a while, but I don't want to just talk about what Science Gallery does. From my own perspective, Science Gallery is a relatively small, new institution. We opened in 2008. We're not, like Nicolette said, we're not a science museum, or we're not an art museum. We're not a science gallery, or we are a science gallery. We're not a art gallery or an art museum. We have no permanent collection. We're small, we have 4 exhibitions a year, constantly changing, that we produce ourselves. And in under 10 years, we've become one of the top 5 free attractions in Dublin. Why is this important? Why has this kind of blooming, why am I pointing this out? I think because Science Gallery is an unexpected place to many of the people who come there. So 3 examples of what you'll see there. This is a performance by an artist who reanimated 2 pig hearts as part of our show Oscillator, which was about oscillations, and the heartbeat was one she wanted to focus on. It was a collaboration between artists and a scientist. It was very difficult, required a lot of precaution, health and safety, but people really enjoyed this almost beautiful, poignant performance of reanimating 2 hearts in the gallery. They were from pigs that were being slaughtered for the meat anyway, so these pigs weren't killed just for their heart, for art. Although you could have a debate about, is it better for an animal to die for art than for meat, I suppose. But that's for another show. In another scenario, you see a lot of 15 to 25-year-olds in my slides. That is our core target audience, young people. These are the demographic, at least in Ireland and much of the world, who attend galleries and museums the least. So we go for them the most. This is a game of poker where an artist has hooked you up to galvanic skin response, and there were displays that said what other people were feeling as they bluffed in poker. And this was an exhibition about risk. And lastly, real science. This is something you may experience as you're viewing art. This is an experiment where, in a nutshell, these are little motors and robots and servos attached to cameras. As you walk through the space, you stimulate the motors, but these motors are hooked up to rat neurons thousands of miles away in a dish, and they're reacting to you. So in a way, you're interacting with rat neurons, and then this is being used by the researchers to study epilepsy and seizures. And real science is happening with your interaction in the gallery. We've actually had a few peer-reviewed papers come out of things we've done. But what is the future of museums? If this is the present, if what you're doing is the present, and who is going to make the future of museums? That's my question to you. And what I would say is, we may be able to, as museum professionals, predict the future of museums, but I don't think that it will be us who make it. I think our audiences will be co-making the future of museums with us. So how is that happening? A couple examples. At an exhibition on chemistry, we had crowdsourced our exhibition. I don't really like chemistry very much, so I didn't think this was going to be our best exhibition, but it was one of my favorite. We said, how do the elements evoke thoughts in you? What do you think of when you think of titanium and calcium? And on day 2, we had to start emptying the calcium box because so many people brought ostrich eggs. It's very simple, but it was interaction that meant a lot to people, and they became the exhibitor. So they were creating our collection for that show. At museums, I think our visitors will create data. This was, like we talked about, extracting your own DNA. People paid €2 to be shown how to extract their own DNA. And that's great. They know how to extract their own DNA. But what do you do with that? Have you just taught the visitors? Well, we said, if you want to donate that DNA to an experiment, sign this waiver, and you can contribute to a study on genetic resistance to malaria. And you know what? The researchers got 4,000 respondents for that, which is about 5 times what they were looking for, and that data was published in a peer-reviewed journal. So the audience made the data for that experiment. The audience can also make critique when you have controversial topics. This is the moon dust carnation. I don't know if anyone knows about this, but it's a purple carnation which does not occur in nature. It's a genetically modified and patented organism. So you can buy this carnation cut, but you may not, in most countries that I'm aware of, you may not grow it. You may not reproduce it. And this artist was critiquing that by making grafts and regrowing the moon dust carnation. It was actually a lot of work, So he asked our audience, and anyone who wanted to come in on a Saturday, will you help me propagate this to make it into the artwork and the installation? Tons of people came in, and as they were doing it, he explained to them, this is a legal gray area. I'm not entirely sure this is legal, but I don't think we're going to get in trouble. And people got furious. They said, this is ridiculous that we can't propagate this thing that we've bought, that an organism is trademarked. So if we had just told people that you can trademark or patent genes, they might have said, well, that's interesting. But when they were complicit in the act, they became a critic themselves and engaged in this act of civil disobedience, which I thought was really powerful. In museums, people are creating craft. We've heard about Make Magazine, but the hands-on activity is something that I think is going to become more and more important, not just for science museums, not for art museums, not just for design museums, and definitely not just for children. It's very present for museums and institutions for children, but I think it's a great way to engage adults. Creating stories, becoming the exhibitor, especially when you have a topic which is about a narrative. We had a show on failure in the creative process and in the scientific process, and we asked people to share their stories of failure. And you could write it on a little blank slate, and it was wiped away the next day, so you were kind of, it was kind of cathartic. But things like this, forgot my own name at a job interview, I got a better one the day after. People were sharing these stories of failure and felt like they were the exhibitor, and they created a meaningful part of the exhibition. Well, there's two last ones that I think are probably the most important. It's easy enough to get people to come into your space and say, do you want to get hands-on? It's much more difficult to say, what should we do, why should we do it, and get people to interact. A lot of people think that's the museum's job, but how can we involve our audiences in it? And I think that's where the challenge lies with most of all. This was an artwork called the Pirate Cinema, where the artist screened pieces of data that were being BitTorrented over the internet, usually illegally. So what he screens are these little clips, 1 second, 2 second, often of movies. I think Blade Runner is to the left, and there's some other TV show. There were a lot of Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones was up there a lot. But again, this might not be entirely legal. But we wanted to show it, and we wanted to know what was the responsible thing to do. So we had a curatorial discussion in public with the artist, with a professor, and with a barrister or lawyer. And they debated, was it irresponsible to show an artwork that was potentially illegal? Or was it irresponsible not to, when it was asking a significant question about our legal and artistic system? And then we asked the audience what they think, saying, we don't know what we're going to do, and we're going to take your views into account. So we involved them in the curation and deciding what should we do and why should we do it. And the last example I'll show you, where I think we asked a lot of our audience and they rose to the challenge, was the funeral. After our show, Visceral, which was about bioart, we had to finish the show because we don't keep anything at Science Gallery. And with bioart, what do you do at the end of the exhibition? You have to, for most of it, dispose of it, and that means killing it. So we had to kill the art at the end of the exhibition. And I thought that was a really interesting discussion to have. Should we mark this? Is it something that is worthy of respect? Should we have a certain ceremony? What should we do? So we invited about anyone who wanted to come along, and the room was fully packed. It was standing room only, and we said it was a funeral for the show. How do we mark this? We had farmers, we had genetic engineers, we had students, we had artists coming, and they all expressed their views. And there were interesting parallels in how you destroy a cell line and what you do to dispose of artwork and what people thought about it. And I think that's a challenge to ask our audiences, what do we do and why should we do it? So the last question I'll ask is, how or what kind of cultural institutions will thrive in the 21st century? And often I ask when I'm going to a new city, what should I visit? What's your favorite place to go, or do you recommend? When I was coming to Torino, everybody said the Egyptian collection at the museum. Definitely see that. But do you ever ask this of people in your own city, and people often say, the National Gallery, the Natural History Museum, that's where I love to go. I often ask those people, when was the last time you went to that museum that you say you like so much? And they all say, oh, it's been too long, it's been 2 or 3 years, I really have to go. And the problem is, you ask, where do you go the most, or where do you go the most frequently? And often it's the cafe down the road, or in the States, it's the Starbucks. So people go 2 or 3 times a week to a coffee shop, but it's only every 2 or 3 years that they go to the museum that they say they like. How do we reverse that experience? And for me, I think looking at the small, frequent interaction galleries and museums is a very interesting future, because the big museum has been done and is done very well, but the small, embedded community organization or gallery, I think, is a really interesting future to look at. Compare, basically, an IKEA, where you go to hopefully not too often because it's a very tiring experience, for 5 or 6 hours, get all your stuff, and don't go back for years, to the cafe on the street corner where you go a couple times a week, see a friend, you're there for 10 minutes. It's a very different experience, and how can museums be more like that frequent experience rather than that once every few years? So my last slide is to compare, in the 21st century, what are the emerging models of museums and galleries that I think are coming about? The size is obviously a factor. The large museum has been around for a long time with the collection, but the small, quickly changing, and community-engaged museum, I think, is an emerging model that we'll see more and more of. And the key difference here is about the kind of who is doing this. And like I said, the future of the museum, I don't think will be made by us. We may facilitate it, but it will be made by our visitors. The future museum is not for an audience or for a purpose, but it is with your audience and with them to achieve their purpose. And I think that is going to be the emerging model that I hope we emulate at Science Guy, and I see many of you doing, but I think will require us giving over a bit of control to the makers and allowing people to make the future of our museum. Thank you very much.